Tim is known around the area for his archaeological investigations, mostly into colonial sites, 17th and 18th century, and we're very excited to see what he has found for us at the Chapman-Hall House. What I can tell you is that he produced a 200-page report, and it's sitting on my desk. It's about this thick, and it has been an absolute joy to thumb through. I'm very happy to welcome him tonight. Thank you so much, Tim.
Well, good evening. So basically, I'm going to go into, excavation took place 2 years ago in 2022, in the fall of 22. It's been 2 years to process the artifacts amongst a myriad of other archaeological projects. So I just want to thank you for coming tonight. The Chapman-Hall House Archaeological Investigation was made possible through the financial support of LCHA and many generous financial donations. Several of you here, I'm sure. Thank you very much, because it could not have been undertaken without that. Most of you are familiar with the Chapman-Hall House. You know where it's located. Does anyone not know anything about the Chapman-Hall House? Everyone knows something about the Chapman-Hall House. Are you all locally from the Damariscotta, Newcastle area? Raise your hands. The majority of you. Okay.
Well,
that's okay. Pemaquid Peninsula, etc. Okay. So the Chapman-Hall House, circa 1754. I think we've added that now to the date because we're not completely sure of that. But basically, I run a small company called Midcoast Archaeology, and I've worked on many projects in the area, including a 40-year project on the birthplace of the shipbuilding industry, which we're finishing up the field work this season. And I've also located one of the earliest 17th century homestead sites as well. But today we're going to talk about the Chapman-Hall House. So I had to do a little bit of research because I didn't know where the 1754 date derived from. And I do want to back up. I'm not the only one who did the historical research on this. Several people here in the audience did a tremendous amount of work. There was files, the archives of the Chapman-Hall House. They have a couple file drawers there that had a lot of pertinent information. Patty Whitten did a lot of sleuthing for us as well. And Louise Miller has done some work as well. And there's other people I'm hoping not overlook anyone. But there's a bunch of us who've pulled information together over the years. And so I'm going to tell you the story of what we know. But what I did find out is everything wasn't quite as cut and dry as we thought initially. I do know that the first Euro-American deed, I put deed in quotation marks, is from John Brown, which is an early colonial forgery, actually. Samoset's deeded over supposedly 120,000 acres of land to John Brown of New Harbor. Many people have looked into that. It's clearly an early forgery, and it is a copy too. But it's the wording and various other things. If anyone has ever, the book Here First by Jody, help me last name? Batchelder, thank you. She has a nice chapter on Samoset and the John Brown deed. I think it's a really excellent book. I highly recommend it. But anyway, so basically what you see here in front of you is the yellow dot is where the Chapman-Hall House is today. The deed transfer that occurred, but let me back up a little bit. I'm jumping here. So John Brown owned all this land, and then eventually in the mid-17th century, his son, John Brown II, settled in the Damariscotta area. At that time, there were only 6 known settlers on the upper Damariscotta River. 3 of them were on the western bank, what is now Newcastle, in which I've located one of those sites. And then on the eastern side, the Damariscotta side, there were 3 families, and one was John Brown II, and further up into Great Salt Bay, there was Thomas Kimball and Robert Scott. And they all fled during the outbreak of King Philip's War in 1676, and when almost every English settlement north of Saco was burned to the ground by the Wabanaki. And so he fled, and then he deeded over, or it was heired to his son, John Brown III, not to be confused with the Civil War John Brown. He never settled here, John Brown III. But anyway, in 1730, he deeds a small portion of that on the upper Damariscotta River to Edward Brooks in 1730, which I'm sure you can read yourself, which was then sold to Caleb Preble et al. To Nathaniel Chapman in 1753. And so that's where we get the date of Nathaniel Chapman. However, the deed's a little ambiguous, but it is a large tract of land. It was 1/4 of a mile by 1 mile, and it covers a large area, as you can see. We know the western limits of it was at the falls, which is where the bridge crosses over from Newcastle to Damariscotta, where the rapids are in the river. Sometimes they call it the lower falls. And then it extended eastward. Now, exactly, this is an approximation, of course. The rectangle may have been shifted a little bit up here, a little bit further down. May have been up a little bit where Hannaford Brothers is, I don't know. But anyway, nonetheless, it squarely encompasses the area where the Chapman-Hall House is. Do we know if that house was actually Chapman-Hall's? Not necessarily, but we'll get to that in a minute. Now, that was 1753. Nathaniel Chapman, who was originally from Ipswich, actually settled in York, Maine afterward. And he was a yeoman. He was not listed as a housewright before he came here. So he must have been a housewright as he was learning to be a housewright. But usually you put down your main occupation on a deed, and he had listed as a yeoman at the time. So anyway, so this,
What is a yeoman?
a farmer, yeah.
And what is the other one, the house right you mentioned?
Someone who builds houses, yep. And this is just to show you the location today of the Chapman-Hall House. And boy, what a busy intersection that is to work in. And I think of how Chapman and the Halls would have thought of the solitude they once had when the Damariscotta River was the main mode of transportation at the time. So this is an overview and a generalization. I'm not going to go into every single deed transaction that occurred. But basically, think of it as the Chapmans occupied the site, and then the Halls, and then Dodge in the 20th century. So we have Nathaniel and Miriam Chapman, 1754. The 1832 date is a little bit it's incorrect now because we found additional information after I wrote the report, which is always happens because Patty Whitten held it out for me until I finished the report and then said, look what I found. Yeah, so I think this little piece of information is very important. So let me just make we don't have a connection of Chapman to Hall at all, okay? It was kind of a generalization. It doesn't really change a lot, but anyway, that's kind of important. There is a gap still that we haven't filled in that we still need to figure out. But an important piece of information came to light after the report, and it was when Kay Campbell actually was doing some research on the Glidden family, and she stumbled upon some information that one of the Chapman's daughters, Miriam, married Tobias Glidden. Okay, and then Patty Whitten actually did some deed research at the Lincoln County Courthouse and was able to find a deed transaction. And so we have Tobias and Miriam Chapman Glidden to Nathaniel Glidden in 1804, selling the 100 acres of land in Nobleboro. And most importantly, it says, being the same land on which our father Nathaniel Chapman formerly lived. So that's pretty good information. We're not going to ever have anything that's going to say it's right here, but anyway, it's in this right area. And they mention the boundaries. I'm not going to go into all of them, like Benjamin Day and so on. So it all fits in the area. So there's a probability that it really is the Chapman House, which we figured it probably was. But the date was kind of in question, okay? So the other thing I want to mention to you is in my own research on another project, I came across a court record, a lawsuit actually, filed by a Nathaniel Chapman housewright of Newcastle, suing George Barstow, shipwright or shipbuilder of Newcastle in 1770. So I'm not sure why was he over in Newcastle? Was it a son who was also a housewright? We're not sure. But it is a lot more we don't understand. And we only have these tidbits of documents to pull together and try to retell the story as accurately as possible. But nonetheless, clearly, he came here. The oral tradition goes that Nathaniel Bryant was asked to come here by his stepbrother Anthony Chapman, who settled in 1749, at least that's the way the story goes, and to build timber frame constructed houses for the settlers in their first generation. Houses were probably mostly log constructed houses. And so apparently he did that. There's several Chapman built houses in the Damariscotta area. Nonetheless, Nathaniel died in 1804. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, Patty. I think it's 1804. Anyway, he lived to be 100 years of age. They had 7 children, and one of them, as I said, married Glidden. It's not until 1832, however, I think it's 1835 in the pamphlet, but 1832 that the deed is, the property is sold to Tilden and Elizabeth Hall in 1832, and they occupy it till 1907. At least the daughter owns it until 1907, Anna Hall. And they had 3 children. One died, I think it was 1 year and 7 months or something like that, and the son died in Baton Rouge, Louisiana during the Civil War. And the last child, the daughter, Anna Hall, actually never married, and she lived in the house. And then, because she had no heirs to give the land to, she gave it to the Damariscotta Baptist Church. And then they turned around in this interim period here, 1907, 1912, and then eventually it was sold in 1912 to the Woodbury H. and Annie Dodge estate. So they owned it from 1912 to 1959.
Why would it be sold to the state?
Not to the state, to the Baptist Church. She gave the, what are you looking at?
I look at it, it goes from the interim period,
Yep.
then it transferred to Woodbury and Annie Dodge estate.
No, so Annie Dodge is incorrect. It's Annie Dodge estate ends up giving it when she passes away to the Baptist Church.
No, Anna Hall.
Anna Hall, excuse me. Yeah, I messed.
Right,
Yeah.
she gives it to the Baptist
Yes.
Church.
Yeah, Anna Hall,
Interim
sorry.
period, I
Yep.
assume that's owned by the Baptist Church.
Yep.
Okay, why would the Baptist Church sell it to an estate?
No, it's not supposed to be that. It's supposed to be, they sold it to Woodbury and Anna Dodge, and then the estate later
The
on.
estate sold
Yes,
it to
yes,
Chapman-Hall.
yes,
Okay,
yep, sorry.
thank you.
Yep. And then eventually, so Woodbury Dodge, I'm going to go through this in a second. I'm just kind of rounding it out here. I'll talk about all of them later. Woodbury Dodge, by the way, Tilden Hall was a blacksmith, by the way. Okay. And then Woodbury Dodge was also a blacksmith, but he built another structure in close proximity to where the Bath Savings Bank is, but a little to the west, kind of between the Chapman-Hall House and the Bath Savings Bank, actually, I found out. So that area is heavily disturbed. And then basically the estate, after the Dodges passed away, they died the same year, I think it was 1956 actually, so maybe the 59 is the estate. But anyway, in 1960, the concerned citizens were worried. There was talk of the Chapman-Hall House being torn down for a gas station at one point. And it was one of the earliest extant houses that survives. Obviously, there was earlier houses that no longer exist, but and so they came together. The Chapman-Hall House Preservation Society was formed in 1960, and they operated it from there to 2008. They had there was no furnishings in the house at the time. It was in a very dilapidated state of condition. They had a historic preservationist, Abbott Lowell Cummings, they consulted with about what types of furnishings that would be appropriate for the 3 rooms that they had proposed of 1754 for the kitchen, the east room to be 1790, and then the west front room to be 1820. And so they brought in objects like that. And then the Lincoln County Historical Association in 2008 took it over, and they're the stewards today. What I did was I did some research on extant historic maps, and the earliest map that I can come upon is a sketch map, actually, a detailed sketch map by Ira Chamberlain depicting Damariscotta as it looked in 1805. This is a sketch map, but understand he was 13 years old at the time, but he's reminiscing when he's in 1880s when he's 93 years of age. So you always have to wonder, I'm sure you have family members where you've had a story and you're like, oh, that's not how I remember it. So we take it with a grain of salt, but I do believe that some of it's probably fairly accurate, and I know some sites on the Newcastle side, this is just a small section of that sketch map, are accurate from my own research. But anyway, I circled the area that says the Chapman House. And if I had the whole map in the far corner, you would see something that said that Cottrell, Matthew Cottrell, had a store out of the Chapman House in 1785. So we at least know it's existing in 1785 based on that information as far as a document goes. And why they had a retail store there, I'm unsure. The next map, there's another map in between, but there's nothing on that lot. The lauded Noblesboro map doesn't have any house existing on that map, which makes no sense. There's no explanation for that, so I didn't put that one in here. Obviously, it existed before that, or we assume so, the sketch map. The detail of the 1857 Lincoln County map, most of you are probably familiar with. There's a nice copy of that over at the Lincoln County Courthouse, Registry of Deeds, where the old deed room used to be, just outside of it. And you can see here, you can see T Hall. Can you see that? Right here. And what's interesting to me is you see that it has the barn. There's a barn in the shed. So those buildings go back much further than we thought initially. Now, whether they were ripped down and rebuilt, I don't know. This 1878 panoramic bird's eye view of Damariscotta, Newcastle, showing the location of the south-facing Hull House. You can see here, again, you can see the extended buildings on the back side of it. The barn no longer exists. The other section is what is now the exhibit room for mostly shipbuilding, the history of shipbuilding. So just to the right, just to the east or the right side, if you're facing the Chapman-Hall House today, this was what Woodbury Dodge had constructed in the 1916. This is a 1916 photograph showing the sign over the door that reads W.H. Dodge Blacksmith and Carriage Works. So he constructed this building where he conducted his work, and from 1912 to 26. Then, for unknown reasons, oh, here it is, just to show you the relationship to the Chapman-Hall House. What I want you to, I'm trying to point out here to you is you see what little land hasn't been messed around with. You can see there's a driveway going to another outbuilding over here, and so there's very little land that hasn't been disturbed. They also put in later on, this is 1930 image of Weeks and Waltz Motors. This is where Weeks and Waltz Motors was first located, actually, before it was moved to Water Street and then to Newcastle later on. And so you can see they've now put in gas tanks and pumps, so they've considerable disturbance of the ground there. And then later on, it was Lincoln Tire Service. And this structure was raised in 1962 when the Chapman-Hall Historic Preservation Society wanted to remove all of that. I did find a plan of this is the estate of Woodbury Dodge. I think it says 1959 on it. And what it did, it didn't have the Chapman-Hall House on the lot. I don't know why. They focused on the business structure, which I've highlighted in blue for you here. And the red line that you see going through the blue structure is what the Preservation Society sold to Bath Savins. So part of it is probably where the road wraps around, the driveway wraps around the building, and the rest of it's on part of the lawn today of the Chapman-Hall House. Here they're removing the building, the Lincoln Tire Service, taking it completely down. And then this is the nightmare I came across, this following photograph. Archaeologists don't like to see things like this. Extensive ground disturbance. And if you look up toward the Chapman Hall House, you can see mounds of soil going way up, and it says sign danger on it. So they really did move a lot of soil. I'm guessing they ripped the superstructure of the business down, and then they bulldozed the foundation over, and then they brought in lots of fill and redistributed that to make it more even. And here, after that, they hired workmen, look like teenagers maybe, just distributing soil really close to the Chapman House, which you see on the left side. So the reason this is important to me is I don't want to spend a lot of time in an area that's highly disturbed. And unfortunately, we came across these after we did the archaeology. But we did stay close to the house, and I'm glad we did. But you'll see some disturbance in some of those images as well. So here it is today, just to put it in proximity, the main street in the foreground. You get the Baptist Church parsonage to the left, which actually the driveway cuts through the bank going down, and then the Bath Savings off to the right. All right, so below ground at the Chapman-Hall House lot. It was a 2-week dig, as I said before. an archaeological investigation with the objectives of that project was severalfold. One was to determine the integrity of the archaeological deposits in the ground, to determine the earliest occupation of the Chapman-Hall House, if possible. It was also to look at what material cultures did the Chapmans in the Halls, and to a lesser extent, the Dodge family, possess, and do the artifacts, the three-dimensional objects that are currently housed in the museum, do they reflect the types of artifacts or objects that these families would have had? And if not, could we augment the collection by making it more accurate by looking at some of the artifacts that we did discover, particularly from the 18th century? Here's an archaeological site plan of the Chapman-Hall House and grounds. Bird's eye view looking down. The red squares are our excavation units. We conducted 9 excavation units on all sides of the Chapman-Hall grounds, with an emphasis to the north and east side, as you can see. The east side and the north side was the best preserved. And this is just the units here. You don't need to see that probably, but. So we first focus on the right side or the east side of the Chapman-Hall House. The logic there was, let's excavate close to the kitchen windows in case kitchen refuse was thrown out, or there was a kitchen midden behind the house, which is to the very right. You can see a small portion of the backside. So we started excavating here. There's Jeff Miller. We excavated. I should go back. I just want to mention to you, archaeology is not treasure hunting, and I know most of you know that, but some people don't. It's not just randomly excavating. It's a controlled excavation, and we've set up a grid system over the entire lot in northern and eastern coordinates. And each excavation unit is a 1 meter by 1 meter square. So we excavated in metric system here. And we excavate by stratigraphic break. So there's different colored layers in textures of the soil, and each of those soil layers represents a different time period or activity that occurred at the site. And it's kind of like detective work, trying to go back in time, peeling the layers off, and trying to determine what occurred. So here's a typical stratigraphy at the site. Very dark brown soil that most of you like to plant things in. This shows me that it's been highly plowed, or at least gardens have taken place here. We have documentation of that as well by the Bristol Garden Club in the 1960s. They removed, I think, the rose bushes, and they put some additional plants in there. But so this is what you see as a very homogeneous brown, dark brown soil layer, and that's where the majority, almost all of the artifacts, material culture is coming from. The orange-yellow soil down below is naturally deposited subsoil that has not been altered by humans. Okay, that's also called the B horizon, where the high iron oxides concentrate in the soils. I'm sure you've seen that in excavations and so on. Down south, it would be a reddish soil. However, so what we did is we opened up 3 contiguous 1 by 1 meter squares, making a trench 1 by 3 meters, basically. And so as I move to the left of this image, you'll start to see a difference. So the one to the far right is what I was just showing you. And now you see a much deeper, the natural subsoil goes deeper, dives down here. That tells me that this has been excavated beforehand. And I know that because the material culture is completely mixed up. In Stratum 1, we had artifacts from the 18th century to the 20th century lying next to each other, unfortunately. We found this kind of an olive, it may be hard to see, but below the dark brown, there's a kind of an olivey drab color soil before you get to that orange soil. And now we're going to flip to this side, and you're going to see a huge difference. Look at how many layers you see there. That tells me that that soil's been really moved around. And we found, a lot of mixed artifacts in the area. I'm going to show you just a few of the images, because I have enough images here to talk till midnight. I'm sure you don't want me to do that. So this is some of the ceramics that we found. That actually one of the first units by the kitchen, the east side of the house. We found some really nice artifacts. The top left-hand corner is a coarse red earthenware, a utilitarian type of ware used for storage and preparation of foods. The second one is English white salt glaze stoneware of a basket, diaper and basket pattern, which is typical of the mid to late 18th century. That fits very well into the occupational date range of the site, the first occupational date range. And then to the right is a black basalt stoneware from England as well. I'll go into more of that in detail. I'm not going to go through all the ceramics here, but basically Down the second row, to the far right of the first row, you have a rope pattern creamware, Wedgwood creamware. Famous potter made it, and then everyone copied it. And then you have lots of pearlwares and various other things, ceramics. So this is looking down from the Chapman-Hall House down at the 3 contiguous 1 by 1 meter squares that were excavated. You can see here, we also found, in addition to finding artifacts that we separate by the different layers, so we have vertical control, we also have these archaeological features. An archaeological feature is something that you need to study in situ or in the ground. What that means, for example, a feature would be like a post mold where a post used to be, a Native American hearth, a chimney base, a cellar hole, a privy. Those things you study in place and you give them a designated number. We found feature 1 over here was very disturbed. I think it was, there's a picture of a fence line right up there near the building when they were doing the construction of, I should say the destruction of the structure just to the east. And so it's probably derives from that. I mean, if you were to dig a hole today, put that soil off to the side, you're probably going to go down several feet and you're going to mix up the multiple layers of soil. And if you fill it right back in, you've changed the color just enough so 300, 400 years from now, if it's not disturbed, we can detect where that was, and we can also detect the hole that you dug for that into the subsoil. So subsurface, that was to the east. Now we're going to subsurface test to the north side of the Chapman-Hall House into the herb garden, which Betsy Evans helped remove the herbs. And then I came across this picture in 1966 of the garden club disturbing heavily the area. You can see large stones, looks like foundation stones, and earth being moved about. And there's several other pictures. I didn't put them all in here because it was too depressing. They also made a very detailed plan of what herbs went where. The EU4 is excavation unit 4, which is right behind the back of the house below one of the kitchen windows. And here we are, excavating the herb garden. Now, we did find a tag that said herbs on it, so we were right. But anyway, we always have issues with various conditions, soil conditions. In this case, we had very loose soil, so it was nearly impossible to kneel. Usually you kneel outside of your excavation unit so you're looking for features, stains and stuff, and if you're standing in it, it's really hard to see them. But in this case, if I put any pressure on those walls outside, the unit would have collapsed. So I literally had to be contorted into this 1 by 1 meter squared to excavate it. And so what we found was, again, more disturbance, because it's a garden probably. Lots of stones. You can see right here, this is the back of the kitchen looking down. You can see the foundation going from left to right here. And these may have been excess stones, because you have to remember when they built a house, they only faced off for the cellar portion or the foundation, but in this case, it's not even the cellar on this side of the house, but they often would have irregular stones sticking out that were buried because no one would ever see them, right? But you can see here, can you see it's very subtle, but there's disturbed colors. It's not even a whole layer. It's just different colored soils in there. And that just, again, is indicative of a lot of disturbance of the soils. Thank you, Garden Club. We can see here's a sign that says herb, the tag. A peach pit, various other artifacts that mostly date from, well, some of them could possibly be late 18th, early 19th in 20th century. You have the nails, you have a machine cut nail, and some wire nails as well. This is down further into the soil, second area, and whiteware. Whiteware doesn't come in until 1820 and comes into all the way to the 20th century. And we had a 1917 U.S. Lincoln head penny. We also had, though, that little yellow piece, we'll get to it later, but that's a piece of Staffordshire from the 18th century. It's a small little shard that's like nothing to most people. You do this for 40 years, you know this stuff. Here we have, further down, a 22 bullet shell, screws, modern screws. If they're 18th century, they would be blunt ends. They would come to a point. Again, machine cut nail, and various other ceramics and window glass, of course. So after that, we opened up smaller. We excavate these units 1 by 1. If we don't excavate the whole thing, we still divide the unit into quadrants: northwest, northeast, southwest, and southeast. In this case, we're only excavating a quadrant of each of these, of 1 by 1, the 5 and 6 here. So we're off to the northeast of the house, and we wanted to try to get good ground coverage of the entire lot. So here's one. This guy has a degree in archaeology from Cornell, who's assisting, and he came across the remnants of a earlier walkway leading to the L of the Chapman-Hall House. You can see it right here. You can see it's concrete and brick, so it's not terribly old. And below that, we hit, I think it was 7 layers of soil. If you start to count them down, it's very subtle because it's dried. It was very dry that year. But more interestingly is this darker layer. That was where some of the remnant 18th century occupation was found, of the late 18th century. But remember, this is the area where you saw that bulldozer piling up all the soils and everything. That would account for why we have such a mix of soils here, because that's not typical, that's atypical. Some of the artifacts we found from that dark brown layer down near the bottom, just above some bedrock, natural bedrock, we found a piece of feather-edged creamware from England, and a thimble and a button, thimble fragment I should say. And then we have some fossil remains down below, probably a rib to a pig, some fish vertebrae, and some shellfish of quahog and soft-shell clam. Remember, they didn't have someone picking up the trash on Thursday morning. They literally threw their trash out the doorway. And sometimes, quite often, it would be like we call sheet refuse, where they would just fling it out into the yard. And other times, more usually in urban settings, where they would actually have a focus place for their trash. It wasn't until in the 19th century they started having, these so-called bottle dumps and tin can dumps, where people went further afield as they realized, oh, maybe it's not so good to throw our garbage right near the house. So here we are excavating this. You can again see the multiple layers on the right side going down. The very bottom, dark brown, is where we found the majority of kind of a remnant intact 18th century occupation layer. But it was very shallow, as you can see. We also focused a little bit on the front side of the house, which was very challenging and very loud. I mean, there's a street sign, street lights are right there. You have loud trucks going by. I had someone roll down the window and ask if we'd found any old coins. And I said to him, I thought you were going to ask for burger and fries. He said, do you have that? I said, no, and he drove off. But here's an earlier photograph. I didn't see a date on this particular image, but it's an earlier picture probably. I mean, there's a little thing on the side of the telephone pole that says, do not hitch your horses here. So, so it's probably early 1900s, I'm guessing. What do you think, Patty? So back that up. So there's some disturbances. They have lilac bushes. Multiple things have been planted in different places. Keep planting them in the same places, everybody. And then every time I come here, now they took the rose bushes gone and the sign's gone, but I understand why now. But anyway, so we have the picket fence to contend with. And the road has widened over the years. First it was probably just a cart path in the 18th century to get down to the river. And then as the 20th century went along, horses and automobiles, and now we got lots of trucks and everything. The road has widened and has taken in more of this. So now it's only a very small portion of what Nathaniel Chapman originally owned. Here it is in the 2022 excavation. You can see the 18th century ghost above us, I think, looking down our excavation there. But so here we are excavating. We put 2 excavation units on the front lawn, and on the left side, the west side, the house faces south, which makes sense, right? They wanted the maximum sunshine on the front side of the house, which is typical in the 18th century. Here we see that we have a water main of some sort. Right here, feature 5, you can see the trench that they had dug into the subsoil. See the yellow subsoil over here, and they excavated beyond that into this more subsoil, but it was the sea horizon. It was olive color. And we came across this. So that's disturbed, obviously, that section, right? You can see it in profile here. You can see the various layers. You can see the cut going down through the layers of the soil. And again, we found, on the front, we found more 19th, 20th century artifacts scattered, and not as many as we did on the backside, which makes sense. We had a lot of architectural things like nails and quite a few bolts we found, 20th century bolts and nuts and washers, probably something to do with maybe Woodbury or Dodge. Modern bottle glass, the bright green glass, and tinfoil. That's always fun to find. And then here's another section we excavated on the front lawn. Again, similar artifacts I just told you about. You can even see some wire here. electrical wire. We did find a Quang 1885 U.S. Indian head penny. It's pretty good shape. We didn't find any colonial coins, but you have to understand, yes, there were colonial coins, but there was a shortage of coinage in the American colonies, and they did a lot of bartering because of that. Sometimes you do find low denominational coins, but they didn't lose them that often. So, and remember, we only tested a small area of the site. We also wanted to put a test pit on the west side. Remember I told you this is the Baptist parsonage is right here, and you can see how the land drops off, and then it comes back up here. So they obviously cut through for the driveway, and so that's why you have that artificial drop there. But this was the saddest unit we excavated. We immediately found just a very thin layer of topsoil with a couple artifacts, and then we found sandy actually not sandy, it was gravel, hard pan gravel. We had to use a pickaxe, right, Charlie, to excavate that. And we went over a meter down, and it continued, and we just said, okay, well, there's no point in going any further because whatever was there is gone. I'm not sure what caused that, what that was for. It's a little distance from the house. They could have put a tank in there of some sort, or maybe something to do with the water main, I don't know. But anyway, unless someone knows the history, I'd say the last 50 years of the 20th century, that's probably when it happened. So the material world of the Chapman-Hall family is what I was interested in, the artifacts, right? So these examples of newly hand-forged nails by none other than Jeff Miller of Flintlock Forge is right here, who does a lot of docent work there, as his wife does, at Chapman-Hall House. And they sell these there. And I said, this is great to show kids because most of the nails we found were severely corroded to the point where it's like, I think that's hand forged. It could be machine cut. It's hard to tell. You could have like 10 people look at it and they might say something differently. But so what we did is in the next chart, this is the number of nails we found. You can see we found a total of 1,740 nails on those 9 excavation units. You'll see there's a huge amount, 458, which is 26.3% of all nails could not be identified due to the severe corrosion on them or so highly fragmented. That would be just totally guessing. Hand forged were 85 or 4.9% of total nails, and then machine cut nails were 786 or 45%. And then the wire nails were pretty high as well, which you would expect because remember, this was continuously occupied into the 20th century. And the ceramic assemblage was pretty amazing. We had quite a variety. We had over 1,200 shards of ceramics were found. And there you can see the dates up there. A white salt. I don't know if you can read them. Can you read them from there? Yes, you can. Read them better than I can on this little screen here. So I'm not going to go through them all, but I mentioned some of them beforehand. What's interesting to me more than that is here's the major ceramic types that you find in the 18th century going into the 19th century. And I list them here in the date ranges. And what you see is there's a complete dearth of Delft ceramics being found in our excavations, and only a small portion of white English salt glaze stoneware. And then you have creamware, although that's not heavy, it is there, which you would expect to find. And you'd expect to find in a mid-18th century house more Delft. You'd expect to find some Delft for sure in white salt glaze. So what does the ceramics tell me? Again, this is fairly preliminary because we only excavated a small area of the site. We tried to put them around the whole grounds to kind of represent each side of the house. And I questioned archaeologically, is it really from 1754? Do we know just because he bought the land that he built the house in 1754, 53 to 54? Could he have built it in 1770? I would push more to that. But again, we'll go into a little bit more later, but maybe more work would need to be done to really say that for sure. Even you can be here and find very little and disturbed, and over here might be this beautiful deposit of intact 18th century material that would more fully represent the Chapman-Hall occupation. I've compared the Chapman-Hall house in red to 3 other 18th century sites I've worked on. The Hale site and the Bryant Barker Tavern site are 2 of the first shipbuilders known to have built on the Damariscotta River in the 1765 time frame. Down below you'll see Delft ware going across. You can see the Hale site had a large number of percent-wise Delft compared to white salt glaze, creamware, and pearlware. For the other sites, you don't see as much, right? 0.3 for Bryant Barker, 0.5, and none for Chapman Hall. And then white salt glaze is represented lower amounts, 2 for Bryant Barker and Jacob Graffam Jr., which was a site in Cushing, Maine. And creamware is fairly well represented in all of them, but fairly low in the Chapman-Hall House. And that's the earliest creamware comes in 1762 to 1820. Now, again, someone could have some of this stuff lasting longer. My mother has some ceramics she got from the first National grocery store in the 70s that we use regularly, and they still exist. And it's, what, how many years later? How many decades later? But usually these everyday wares were used and not put in a china closet, and so they were used often and frequently got broken, and so they don't usually last too long. But there was pearlware, and not too much pearlware as well, although you do for the Chapman Hall House, you have a lot of pearlware. And that makes sense because it's going from the late 18th century into throughout the entire 19th century. So the question is, what's going on? Clay tobacco pipes. Ceramics and clay tobacco pipes are the most easily identifiable and datable for an archaeological site in the American colonial period. We didn't find hardly any pipes, however. That was discouraging. I think we found a total of 10 tobacco pipe bowl fragments and 3 stem fragments. And what you have here is it's the same pipe here shown when we first excavated it and after we reconstructed it. This is a typical mid-19th century TD clay tobacco pipe bowl with a heel. And for Tim Dinsmore, probably, the TD. But so that was a common initial that was put on in the late 18th century on clay pipes in England, and they became very popular and with a test of quality, and then everybody started copying them. And so everyone started putting TD on their clay tobacco pipes. My grandfather in the early 20th century smoked a TD pipe. So they had them all the way into the early 20th century. So they're not really datable, but the morphology, the shape of the bowl tells me it's a second to third quarter of the 19th century pipe bowl. We found this amongst a deposit of coal and ash, and you can see that it must have been pretty darn hot because it deformed the bowl, as you'll see down here. It's oval, it melted it in the heat from the coal. Interestingly enough, we went through the archives at Chapman Hall. We found the Chapman Hall Preservation Society had found 2 clay pipes while doing renovations in the house, and they inquired at the Smithsonian Institute, and they replied saying that they were from the first quarter of the 19th century. They were also TD pipes, so they're not 18th century pipes. However, the stems are harder to determine. Bore holes running through pipe stems change throughout time, from large to small. We're in the time frame where we found a 5 4/64 of an inch bore diameter running through the stem. And so they can date anywhere from 1710 to 1800 plus, because 4 was the smallest hole. So even if you had a 1910 pipe, it would be 4/64. So that doesn't really tell us a lot either. They didn't smoke a lot, apparently, at the Chapman Hall House. So again, one of those goals that we wanted to do was try to determine if the materials that we did find are reflected in the materials that were purchased or donated to the Chapman Hall House and currently in the museum. The Chapman Hall House kitchen set is to circa 1754. And then the east front room, 1790, where they have several ceramic and glassware vessels that I do feel are mostly accurate for the time frame of 1790. They represent quite well. And so what I've done here is I've taken some of the shards that we uncovered to show you objects that I suggested in my report that should be purchased, whether they're antiques or high-quality reproductions that they could put in the house. Because we always try to do in these things is to accurately portray what the families would have had in the time frame. So here's a small shard of a redware milk pan, and then this is what one would look like if it was complete. And that would be fitting for the kitchen area or the makeshift buttery. The shard that I showed you, the yellow shard, the Staffordshire, here's an example of what it would have looked like. It would have been like to a small cup, a posset cup from England. Remember the feather edge creamware? This would be a complete plate of feather edge. We also found that small shard, 2 shards of dot diver and basketware English white salt glaze. We could purchase a plate of that as well. in a small tiny shard of jackfield ware, which was produced from 1740s to 1780s. That was the heyday of it. And on to the left, you see examples of tea wares of this. And we found some at the Barstow site on the Newcastle side from the 1765 context that was very ornate, like these tea wares. So these are mostly tea wares as far as the jackfield ware goes. So one thing that was peculiar that we found, that was not something we usually find, is we found some black basalt ware. And let me just, so I don't mess that up, which can date circa 1750 to 1820, although they did make it later on as well. What you see, though, is we found these shards in two contiguous units of that trench, in one of the smaller excavation units to the northeast. And they all seem to fit to the same object. At first, we thought it was to a teapot, but it's not. It's to a bowl. The form of the teapot doesn't work as far as the rim. Ours is very regular. But anyway, it has Wellington on. You can see here in this shard right here, it says Wellington. And I'm going to read a little bit of this because I don't know this by heart. But anyway, basically, these were British commemorative wares that were shipped off, unloaded onto the American market in the late 18th century, or in this case, the first quarter of the 19th century, because this vessel would have been dated June of 1813. It says contained insignia of Duke of Wellington, and it says on the other side, India, Portugal, and Spain, Victoria, 21 June of 1813. And we know that the Duke of Wellington is depicted, defeated Napoleon on land at the Battle of Waterloo near Brussels, and Wellington was a hero throughout Europe for that reason, ending 23 years of war between Britain and France. So I think that's a pretty neat object to find at the site. Our piece is 1813, so it's a hair earlier than that, 1815. He also played a role in the War of 1812, urging Britain to accept the treaty which brought the war to the end with the United States. And so he was favored by the Americans. That may make sense why they would want some tea wares of Wellington. And so here's what the bowl would have looked like if it was complete. And here's a portrait of Wellington, who became the Prime Minister of England in 1828. That might be harder to find an object like that. I looked at them; they're pretty expensive when you find them, like over $1,000 at least. We also found small shards, not a lot, of wine. I say wine bottle because they could have used them for many different liquids, obviously. But they're olive green. This is a typical 18th century one that is, as an example, and we have just small fragments. The artifacts are very highly fragmented about the site, which tells me they were thrown out as opposed to just dug and thrown in one place. We like abandoned well where they use it as a trash receptacle or privy. After they ceased using it as a privy, they often would fill it in with trash, and then you have a high chance of putting the entire object back together. But in this case, it's been kicked around, walked on, and then the other disturbances later on that we talked about earlier. Off to the right, you'll see a case bottle, example of a case bottle. These are typical bottles that you'd find in the 18th century, and I think those would be fitting also for to be displayed in the museum. To the right, we found part to an English wine glass with folded foot, and you can see examples of what one would look like. There's many different styles, you understand, of the top of the wine glasses. So that's a total guess on which one we'd get, but we know the time frame to choose from. We also found the TD pipe. We should have a pipe, and that would be fitting for the not 1790, but the 1820 room, correct? And so we should have at least a clay tobacco pipe would be good to have in the museum as well. Another important aspect of the project was education, to teach the public about the importance of archaeology and how it can augment in interpreting historic sites. What I find is that taking various different aspects and bringing them together, synthesizing the historical record with the archaeological record and various other studies, can give us a much more accurate portrayal of what took place in a particular site. And we had a great turnout during this. It's well advertised in the Mid-Coast area. On weekends particularly, we had quite a few people there. And you can see this kid's really into it, looking through this screen, looking for anything we overlooked. But we had a lot of people come. It was fun. I really enjoyed teaching archaeology. I've been doing it for a long time. Concluding thoughts. The Millers are overlooking me. That unit is not straight. No, they're supposed to be the ghost images, right? But anyway, so the 2-week archaeological survey was successful. Again, 9 excavation units. We found over 7,757 artifacts and non-artifacts. Ground disturbance was encountered in many of the excavation units, resulting in a mix of historic materials representing the entire occupational date range, circa 1754 to the present. Some partially intact deposits were encountered on the north and east sides, close to the Chapman-Hall House. The absence of delftware and only a couple white salt glaze stoneware and relatively low numbers of creamware puts into question the construction date of 1754. For now, I would suggest, and I think they've already done that anyway on their own, put circa 1754 to be emphasized. The results of the archaeological survey should be considered preliminary given the limited ground coverage, and it doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't date to 1754. It could very well. I think it probably does. My gut feeling is. Another 2-week survey would provide better coverage of the area to make sure to see if it replicates what we have in the future. I also suggest in the report a dendrochronology study, that's tree ring dating for any of you that don't know what that means, would be recommended on structural elements of the house to more accurately date the earliest construction date. And there are some pitfalls to consider in that, right? Because sometimes they would reuse timbers from an earlier house, they did alterations later on, and so on. But again, if you take that, the dates from that, in the documentary record and the archaeological record and put them all together, if they start to all come up with kind of the same date range, it's probably very accurate. Additional deed research is needed to fill in a gap in the chronological sequence of the occupation of the homestead. 18th century historic artifacts recovered during the survey are not currently reflected in some of the objects displayed in the House Museum, although the objects that are in there are very representative of the time. The recommendation is that, like objects, like I mentioned before, antiques or high-quality reproductions be purchased and more accurately reflect what the Chapman and Hall families once possessed. I also think it would be nice in the future to have a small exhibit telling the story of the Hall families, because we don't, I mean, it is in the name Chapman-Hall, and yet all 3 rooms are when the Chapmans occupied the house. And also, in the future, we'd like to have a small exhibit showcasing the results of the archaeology as suggested. That's it. Thank you. If anyone has any questions, I'm free to shoot away. Yes?
What can you say about the Chapman family and how they fit demographically into others living in the Damariscotta area? What kind of a family was this?
I haven't done a deep.
Would you please repeat the question for you?
He was asking if I know anything about the Chapman family and how the demographics of the Chapman family. And
You see the kind of china and glassware that they were using.
Yeah.
And what does that say about them? Did everybody have that kind of china and glassware?
That's a great question. He's asking if anyone had the same type of material culture artifacts that we found. And it's very typical. The artifacts, almost all these sites I work on, are pretty typical. There's nothing unusual. Maybe the basalt stoneware is fairly unusual, but I talked to a ceramic specialist who is editor of Ceramics in America, and he said they unloaded the commemorative pieces onto the American. And so I guess they're not uncommon, but it's the only time I've come across black basalt. But most of these wares, the ceramics in particular, are very typical of the time period. And again, I don't know. I didn't trace back the Chapman family, for example. I know they were in Ipswich. I don't know when they came to Ipswich. Do you, Patty, or anyone? The Millers, do you know?
It's late 17th century.
Yeah, the late 17th century. They're coming over from England. But I think they're pretty typical. I mean, again, they were in York and they came here. And there was mostly English here. I mean, obviously the Scotch, Irish settled by Dunbar in 1729, 1730 time period in towns in what is now Boothbay. In Walpole, he laid out Walpole, which went all the way up to what is now Nobleborough. So I think they're pretty typical. I don't know. I can't really give you a lot more because I didn't do a deep dive on the particular family at this time. But sorry. Yes?
How would you date the fireplaces?
The fireplaces, well, that's not my expertise, but
Oh, okay.
that would probably be, what's his name?
Darren?
Uh,
Or less fossil?
No, Irons, Richard Irons I was thinking. Richard Irons would be an expert on stuff, and other people like you just mentioned as well, how to date the fireplace.
Well, I didn't know if that would coordinate with the.
Yeah, no, I don't think
the
so.
other artifacts
Right.
that you found.
No, I mean, it's definitely typical 18th century bricks, I can tell you that. They're pretty, actually they're in pretty hard shape, some of them now, I guess from the winters and everything. The pieces are starting to fall down, but it's pretty typical. It's a very large, I think it's fairly unusual fireplace. Do you want to, it's been reconstructed and stuff over the years, and
But they did use clay mortar.
yeah, they use clay mortar there, yeah. A lot of these sites that I excavate, though, I do find lime mortar in a lot of them. The one I'm working on right now in Newcastle is a 1765-9 home to a blacksmith, and we have mortar all over the bricks, lime mortar. But they're really not, like again, ceramics and clay pipes are the easiest of dating, and glassware if you've got a large enough piece of it. The bricks are not. Brick making started probably in the late 1790s on the Damariscotta River. It's possible there was some undocumented bricks being manufactured in the 18th century here, but as far as established brickyards, they're not until the 19th century. They could have been imported though.
I have a 1760 house
Mhm.
and there's brick.
But we don't where the brick came from, right?
We don't know where the brick
Right.
came from. Right, okay. All right, so the difference in the mortar is clay as opposed to.
And you can't date it based on that either.
Can't
No,
be dated by
no,
that,
it's just
okay.
what they preferred, I think. It's basically the artifacts you find. I find the artifacts around a house. People always go, let's date the house. Well, of course, there's been 4 million alterations to the house over the years, so it's a challenging, it's almost a nightmarish challenge, as we did find out the Curley house next to the Kavanaugh Mansion on Damariscotta Mills. But in the ground, you find artifacts dating to the earliest occupation. And so that's,
Okay.
actually it's probably more accurate dating a house sometimes than looking at the various elements, unless you
I
did.
didn't know if like lifting floorboards, you would see the dirt around where the foundation is for the chimney, if there would be artifacts in that.
Anything is possible. I mean, the thing is, if you have a span of 40 years for a ceramic, it's not going to help pinpoint, too well, right?
Okay, yeah.
We also, when they excavate for a cellar, like the Chapman-Hall House only has a cellar on the west half going south to north of the house, so
My
front to
house
front to
only
back.
has a cellar
And
on
the
one half.
and the chimney is not in the cellar because it would take over most of it, so it's just outside of it, right? And then it's just a
That's what mine has.
foundation, which is typical of the time period.
Oh, okay, because mine doesn't have a cellar.
But what I was going to say is, when they excavated a cellar hole or even a foundation, they had to dig a hole, right? And they usually dig it larger than they need, so they can work on the outside of it, and it's called a builder's trench. And if they drop something temporarily diagnostic for an artifact into the trench, and we know they usually fill them in quickly afterwards, right? Because they're building a house, you're not going to leave the trench open. So sometimes that will help date the earliest occupation of a site. Anyone else? Yes.
What do you do with the artifacts that you found? Do you put them back or do you
Yeah.
take them?
Well, I don't. So they're property of Lincoln County Historical Association, obviously here, and I believe they're going to be stored at the Chapman-Hall House, which makes total sense. I still have them. We still need to put some more tags on some of the artifacts, but I have an artifact release form, which I'll have someone sign, and then they'll be handed over to the Chapman-Hall House, and then we hope to. I've already pulled out artifacts I think would be good for a future exhibit, focusing mostly on the 18th century artifacts. And then what I think would be good is to have an exhibit and have like the little fragment, which is exciting to an archaeologist, but to most people it's like, oh, it's just a little fragment. And then have like, say, the redware shard, and have like an actual milk pan next to it so people can visualize the objects and what they would have been like. It would be a neat way of doing that. It's just about, the problem is you have a space issue at Chapman Hall as far as doing that. So, yes.
I've seen that done with paintings.
Yeah, Dutch genre paintings in
Yes.
particular. They
They do that at Chemical.
They did that particularly in that was more the 17th century. The Dutch did realistic paintings of. They didn't just paint a vase. They actually had detailed Delft. You could tell what kind of Delft pottery it was, or whatever it was, a Bellarmine jug from the Rhineland of Germany. And so you can actually use those. And so Anne Hilton, the late Anne Hilton, who was studying her master's degree, when she put that together for Pemaquid, really brought it to life, having those portraits. Yeah.
And it's space conservative also.
Yep,
You know,
yep,
we don't have to have the actual piece.
yes.
Did I understand you to say that the commemorative piece, that you found pieces of it in 3 different?
Yeah, well, two of the excavation units are contiguous next to each other.
Okay.
And the other one is about, 4 meters to the northeast. And I don't,
They really threw that out.
well, remember, the one to the northeast was where the bulldozer was.
Okay.
So, and to be fair, I really don't know if the shards in that one do fit with the 2 contiguous units yet. But because it's so unique to find in a site, I made the assumption, which I shouldn't do, that they probably go together, but we don't really know that yet.
They may have been part of the set.
It could have been part of a tea set, yeah. That's probably a sugar bowl, and they may have had the whole tea set, and they didn't break everything, right? And again, remember, in the archaeological record, all you have, if it's not a disaster, like a Pompeii, all you have is what's accidentally broken or occasionally some object that was lost. So it doesn't fully represent the material culture of the time. It's only what's there. It's the same thing with the houses that exist today, the 18th century houses that still exist. You're looking at a biased representation of those houses. Like, I mean, they used to have a lot of bank houses that were built on the side of bank-ins, so if your cellar was fully exposed on one side, sometimes the front side, and they weren't aesthetically pleasing to the Georgian architecture in the 18th century, so they didn't last too long. And so that's what I'm getting at. Everything has its bias, including the written record. It was often written by the wealthy, and it was slanted not to the common everyday person. And of course, that's over the last 50 years, that's changed a lot in archaeology. We've focused on looking at the everyday lives of average people in the colonies. And
Tomorrow morning, you start digging about 3 feet and get your roof out.
I think I'm all dug up this season. I'm pretty.
No, me.
Oh, you? Okay, yeah, okay. You can do it, but I want to hear it though, because we want things excavated and controlled, vertical. Yes.
Did you know where that outhouse was?
Not for the Chapman-Hall. We didn't locate one in the Chapman-Hall house. I used to use that as an example of a feature. Another site in Newcastle, the 18th century Brian Barker Tavern site, we did locate the privy, and we found a tremendous amount of more artifacts than soil, so they used it as a garbage receptacle afterwards.
Right.
Yeah. They threw their night soils in there as well, but yes.
What was your favorite thing that you found?
At this site,
Mhm.
I think it was probably the Wellington stoneware, black stoneware. I have found some shards in other sites, but not with a commemorative piece on it. We only found a couple of shards of a Chinese export porcelain. It would be the highest socioeconomic status symbol ceramic in the time. It cost the most. But that's not surprising. I mean, a housewright's not going to have sets of Chinese porcelain probably. And understand, people go through their lives differently, right? They start out, maybe they inherited money, maybe they were poor, and they worked hard, and they elevated their socioeconomic status within a community. And that can be different from here versus Boston, right? So it just depends on where you are geographically as well. Yes?
I didn't see a lot of metal wear at all, no keys or, I mean, just the nails.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't put everything in there because I figured you guys didn't want me to be here for another hour.
Yeah.
There's a whole bunch. I mean, we found a lot of faunal material. We found pig, cow, sheep/goat,
Right.
fish remains, etc. We didn't find any keys. We found a lot of, some of the objects are so corroded. I can't believe how corroded they are.
Yeah.
Preservation wasn't great for iron at the site. But most of the stuff we're finding appears to be of the iron. And it makes sense. We had 2 blacksmiths living there, right? From what, the 1832 or 4, whatever it was, all the way
There's
up.
no utensils or anything like that.
No. But again, it's a hit or miss, right? If I moved the unit over another meter, maybe we'd have found a 2-tine fork, for example. That's why I think another 2-week shot at the site in the future would be good, just to make sure we have a good ground coverage and fully represent what was there. Yes.
Because it is interesting, you didn't find any utensils.
Well, I mean, some sites you don't find hardly any anyway. I mean, they have to break them or lose them, right? One site, the Barstow site, the Hale site we call it, shipwright, we found 13 thimbles at that site. We found 13,000 clay tobacco pipe fragments at that site, the most in any site ever excavated in the state of Maine. And I found out he was retailing in addition to shipbuilding. He was probably paid English manufactured goods for part of the construction of the vessels because of the dearth of specie or money.
Interesting.
Well, thank you. If anyone wants to come up, oops.
Yeah, this area was known for its brick factories.
Yep.
And was no brick really used in construction?
Well, you have the hearth, right? You have the
Oh, the
yeah.
hearth,
It's
sure.
real brick. I mean, they did. That's the only thing I used it in.
They didn't build walls and things like that.
Well, I mean, some sites they had noggin. They actually put bricks in the walls. There's a I think it was a 19th century house on River Road just before the Sneed Spur. I can't think of the surveyor's name. Tor Glendenning's house. When they renovated that, they found all kinds of brick in the interior of the walls. So I mean, that's. I mean, I think the French did that a lot too in Quebec and so on. But usually, though, I'm finding it mostly in hearths, in not necessarily the entire chimney stack. Sometimes it was, and other times it was stone, and then they topped off the top of it with brick.
When was the Perkins home built?
Which one? The one that
The
stands
one
now?
that's in our museum.
The 1837.
1830, so
Yeah.
that's much more recent.
It is, but the Perkins family, I actually investigated the first Perkins house on that property, which dates to the 1750s. Toward the end of the French and Indian War period, it was a garrison house. And we found hardly any bricks in it, just a couple of brick fragments. So we think that they started building that brickyard in about circa 1795 or 1800. Well, thank you all for coming up. Come up here if you have any questions. And we have things to eat here.